My name is Sharon Horowitz. I'm a reference librarian in the Hebraic section. The systematic development of Hebraica in the National Library began in 1912 when a Jewish philanthropist named Jacob Schiff bought a collection of 10,000 Hebrew books, pamphlets, and manuscripts assembled by a book collector, Ephraim Dinard, and gave it to the Library of Congress. Today, the Hebraic section has more than 300,000 books in Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, and other Hebraic script languages. The Hebraic section is part of the African and Middle Eastern division. The other two sections that comprise our division are the African section, which collects materials in sub-Saharan Africa, and the Near East section, which focuses on all topics in the vernacular languages of the Middle East, Turkey, Armenia, Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. Our work includes selecting books to add to the collection, lending books, and sending articles to other institutions via interlibrary loan, and responding to requests for information, both online and in person, from members of Congress, students, professors, and the general public. We sponsor programs like this one to further our missions, to develop our collections, to preserve and to publicize them. In celebration of Jewish American Heritage Month and America at 350, we are honored to have Dr. Laura Arnold Leibman as our speaker. Dr. Leibman has a PhD in English literature from the University of Southern California. Currently, she is the Leonard J. Milberg Professor in American Jewish Studies at Princeton. Dr. Leibman's most recent book is a monograph, Once We Were Slaves, about an early multiracial Jewish family who began their lives enslaved in the Caribbean and became some of the wealthiest Jews in New York. Her writing was described by one reviewer as an artful blend of storytelling and analysis. Today, she will lecture on the topic, 1776, Jews and the American Revolution. And now, finally, please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Arnold Leibman.
Our story today begins on September 15th, 1776, when the British Army invaded the city of New York. Less than 5 days later, the city burst into flames. And by the time the embers burnt down a day later, about a third of the houses in Lower Manhattan, that is to say the entire city of New York at the time, had been destroyed. That area comprised much of the neighborhood in which New York's Jewish community had houses as well as their businesses. And many of the early members of the community lost everything in the fire. You'll see a small star on the screen, and that's where the synagogue was for the city at the time, Congregation Sherith Israel's Mill Street Synagogue. It was only a half a block from where the embers stopped. And this congregation was incredibly grateful not to have lost their fledgling congregation. While there are about 300 Jews in New York City at the time, most of those Jews were not there for the fire. And that was because they had already fled before the arrival of the British mainly to Philadelphia and into Connecticut. And that was because the vast majority of Jews in the city sided with the patriots. I use this example of the Jews of New York to set the stage for what many Jews experienced throughout the Revolutionary War. Jews were a very small proportion of the communities, but an important member of what would become the United States. For those of you who may have watched histories such as the one for the American Revolution by Ken Burns or read the companion volume, you may have noticed almost no mention of Jews. And I see this as a huge missed opportunity because while the number of Jews were actually extremely small, only about 0.1% of the entire population of colonists, their experiences were disproportionate to their numbers. The revolution both shaped Jewish American communities and changed the course of Jewish American history, And in addition, Jews disproportionately to their numbers played an important role in the revolution. In order to retell the story of the revolution through a Jewish lens, I want to break it down into 3 acts. First, to give you a sense of what those Jewish communities were like at the eve of the revolution, a community that I'll suggest was small but mighty. In the second act, I want to talk about their experience during the war itself and the disproportionate number of contributions that Jews made to the revolution's success. And then in the third act or final section of the talk, I want to look at the aftermath of the revolution and how the revolution not only reshaped Jewish lives, but opened up new rights and new opportunities for Jews going forward in the United States. So first act, the eve of the war, that small and mighty community. As I mentioned, Jews were a very small proportion of the colonists who were in the United States or in the 13 colonies at the time. Anytime I have numbers like this, please bear in mind they are very much estimates and hotly debated by scholars. So they are just rough ideas of how many people we think there might have been. So the largest Jewish communities were in the major cities of the colonies. The only one that didn't have a large community of the major 6 communities for the colonists was Boston. So there were a few Jews, but not very many. So the largest ones were in New York and Philadelphia, very closely followed by Charleston. I will note, scholars of Charleston always say that Charleston had more Jews. So again, debated. Newport, we have people counting not individuals, but families. So we know there are about 25 to 30 families. Savannah, slightly less, 6 to 12 families. And then we have a smattering of other places such as Lancaster that had maybe 10 or fewer Jewish families. And that wasn't a major outpost, but will become very important in terms of the story of Jews and the revolution. The mightiness of the Jewish communities, despite those small numbers, really had to do with 5 different aspects. The first of that was the ways in which the colonies offered new opportunities for Jewish colonists. So like their Christian neighbors, Jews came to the colonies seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity, and they often came escaping persecution in other places, whether that was pogroms or just social discrimination. For Jews, however, the British colonies, like the Dutch colonies, were a rare opportunity because Jews were allowed to practice Judaism openly. So that set it apart from other places, such as the Spanish or the French colonies. In addition to those opportunities, the Jews in those 13 colonies were bound together in each city around a single congregation. So that helped create a sense of unity. Third, they were united with other Jews throughout the Atlantic world through networks of support that helped make sure that they were able to survive. In addition, they had help from rabbinical travelers that came through the colonies, as well as what I'll refer to as a few homegrown heroes. So anytime you see these little stars flying through the screen, it means it's an object that will be on display after the talk. So this will give you a little bit of context for the ones you've already seen, as well as the ones coming up. So those new opportunities, in addition to being able to worship openly, and then also in the case of this gentleman who's over on the far left of the screen, who's Jonas Phillips, who was somebody who came as an indentured servant to but winds up being one of the wealthier Jews and leaders of the Philadelphia community. So a lot of opportunity for growth, as well as religious freedom. But in addition, you'll notice in maps like this one of Newport, where I've labeled where Jews lived, they were able to live interspersed amongst their Christian neighbors, as opposed to places in parts of Europe where Jews had to live in ghettos. And this really allowed for a lot of that economic opportunity that we see Jews engaging in. So while they're all living in easy walking distance of that little thing that's labeled S, which is the synagogue, they are able to forge bonds that are both friendship bonds, but also mercantile bonds with their non-Jewish neighbors. In addition to those new opportunities that Jews had in the colonies, they were united to a certain extent within each of these cities around a single synagogue or congregation. So prior to the Revolutionary War, there's only 2 purpose-built synagogues. So purpose-built means we built it, meaning it to be a synagogue, as opposed to I just rented a house and set up some stuff in it. So only 2 purpose-built synagogues. Those are in New York for Shereth Israel and in Newport in what today is called the Truro Synagogue. And then during the war, a 3rd synagogue is built in Philadelphia. And we'll be looking a lot at why Philadelphia suddenly grows so much that it needs a new synagogue building during the war. In contrast, the 2 other congregations in Charleston and Savannah don't get synagogues until after the war, but the people are still praying together in one group. And that unity becomes very important. So despite the fact that the early congregations are all using the Western Sephardic or Portuguese rite for the services, we will get Ashkenazi Jews coming in, and they don't get kicked out like they sometimes do in places in Europe out of the Sephardic congregations. They all worship together. And that really is something that ends up being a major strength for what become the early US congregations. We see some of that influence of the Western Sephardic tradition in the layout of the early synagogue building. So this is the Truro Synagogue today in Newport, Rhode Island. And you'll notice how all the benches face inward. So it looks like a Georgian building, but it has those elements of the Sephardic structure, as well as you can see the women would have been praying upstairs. For communities that didn't have that purpose-built synagogue, they still had Torah arks and gathered together in people's houses in order to pray. And we have relics of those particular congregations, such as this Torah traveling ark that was from Lancaster. And we do know that even when they couldn't build their own synagogues, there was a certain unity between how they were depicting the symbolism within the congregations. So you see above that kind of homemade Torah, the lintel that goes above the Torah ark that's from Lancaster that was carved out of wood by hand, echoes the same 10 Commandment structure that we saw in the synagogue in Newport. Those communities were also united by a revolutionary new prayer book, which was published in 1766 by Isaac Pinto of the Shereth Israel congregation in New York. And this was a translation into English. So you can imagine if you're one of those Ashkenazi Jews and you're in a synagogue worshiping, you're really happy that suddenly you don't have to read prayers in Spanish or Portuguese. But it was also a goldmine for the younger generation who might not have come directly from Iberia and also felt uncomfortable worshiping in a language that was not their native tongue. So English becomes really important for those congregations to create that cohesiveness. But you'll notice this is page 20 from that prayer book. They're still saying a prayer to the government that unites them with the King of England. So this is 1766, and they're saying a prayer to King George, to Queen Charlotte, as well as other members of the royal family. That's going to change both during and following the revolution. The third thing that helped create cohesiveness and support those very small communities were these networks of support that emerged around the Atlantic world. So the main feeders for the early colonies were Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, with Amsterdam being the most important and the place where people often went with their questions about religious practice. But the colonists also, in the 13 colonies, also had help from their co-religionists in the Caribbean. And that's because before 1825, the largest, best educated, and wealthiest Jewish communities in the Americas were all in the Caribbean. So if you look at those numbers, you'll see that Curacao and Suriname have between 4 to 5 times as many Jews as any of the largest communities in what would become the United States. So way more people. And even a really small island like St. Eustatius, which is sort of up and around the side of the Caribbean, which today does not have a large Jewish community, has about twice the number of Jews that you would find in either New York or Philadelphia. So really, a really important way in which those communities are supplying not only people to trade with, but also supplying various religious goods and synagogue personnel for people in those 13 colonies. One of the ways that Amsterdam and then later Curacao, which emerges as the leader of those Caribbean communities, helps position themselves as patrons to the people in the 13 colonies is by sending religious articles. So things such as this Hanukkah, which was given to Honing Dalim, which is the congregation in St. Eustatius, by the Esnoga community, the Portuguese community in Amsterdam. So it's a way of saying, like, look to me for patronage. I'm going to be somebody who's not just a trading partner, but a religious partner with you. So that Torah scroll that we saw out there was a Dutch Torah scroll, and while it's not one of the ones that was, to our knowledge, sent to the colonies, they also sent a large number of scrolls from Amsterdam to the colonies to help people with their worship. And I hope people saw how cute and tiny it is. It's a nice travel size. So again, the estimated population in the Caribbean, much larger than up north, and those Caribbean players become very important early on for establishing people that people in the colonies can trade with and establish marriage relationships with, and we'll see they play a crucial role for Jewish communities during the Revolution. While some of those communities, such as the one in Suriname, had both an Ashkenazi and a Sephardic congregation, or as they're calling it, a High German and a Portuguese synagogue, most of the Caribbean ones also focused around one synagogue and congregation. They often had sand on the floor, as this one in Curacao does. And the structure both resonated with what we'll see coming up in the 13 colonies, but all of them are meant as echoes of the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, the Esnoga, which at the time it was built was the largest synagogue in Europe. So in order to establish those trade routes, in addition to creating networks that allowed religious artifacts to go back and forth, people very strategically married off their children to Jews in other ports. So very small group of people you could marry in your own port town. So they would marry people strategically. If I was somebody in Newport and I wanted to trade with Jamaica, I might marry off a son or daughter to somebody who's a major trader down in that city. So those networks become very important for Jews' key role during the Revolution. At the time, they also helped support Jewish life. We see that while the sugar colonies, such as Barbados, or trading colonies such as Curacao, don't produce a lot of their own food, they're getting in kosher food from the northern colonies, from Newport, from Philadelphia, from New York, getting shipped down. This is a kosher certificate that was accompanying meat that went from Michael Gratz of Philadelphia, who was a trader, down to Barbados. One of the things I find fascinating about these shipments of kosher food back and forth is that at the time, remember, the communities in the Caribbean are bigger and wealthier and better educated. They don't have a lot of kosher food easily accessible or grown on the islands, but they have knowledge. And you'll see letters back to New York and Philadelphia complaining that their kosher certification is not properly done. And so I think it's a good reminder of the different geographies of the colonies. So the fourth element that's super crucial for supporting the small communities are various rabbinical travelers who move around the Atlantic world and bring knowledge. And one of those most important ones was Rabbi Cargill, who's originally from Hebron in the Holy Land, but comes to London, and he's moving around doing fundraising early on, but becomes an important purveyor of Sephardic knowledge throughout the colonies. And he gives the first first sermon by a rabbi that is published in what will become the United States at the Touro Synagogue in Newport, and it's for what's an upcoming holiday of Shavuot. You can see how many different little voyages he makes across his life, and after he goes both to Newport and New York and Philadelphia, he at various points is down in the Caribbean at Jamaica, at Curacao, at Suriname, and finally takes over as the main rabbi in Barbados, where he dies of a tropical disease. So again, these sort of religious leaders are helping provide that web of connections. In addition to people from the Holy Land, we also see people being sent from the European centers, such as Amsterdam, such as Isaac Turo, who becomes the Hazan in Newport for a brief amount. So Hazan means somebody who's kind of like a lay leader. They have more knowledge typically than the other people, but they don't have rabbinical ordination. So somebody like Cargill, rabbinical ordination, Turo, not quite as knowledgeable, but still more knowledgeable than most of the people who are there. So he comes through Jamaica up to Newport, and then after the British lose, since he is a loyalist, he has to take refuge back in the British Caribbean. In addition to those people who are coming from abroad, we start to see at the eve of the revolution some homegrown heroes, some people who are able to have enough knowledge that they are important within the Jewish communities. And importantly, Gershom Mendes is by far the most important of these. He's somebody who has ties to the secular community in New York as well. So he's able to provide some of that bridge that we see going on with merchants in addition. And he becomes important during the revolution when he takes refuge from New York and hides out first in Connecticut and then importantly in Philadelphia. And that leads us into the second act, the war itself. So how is the war changing Jewish life? The first thing to note is that British occupation of all the major cities where Jews were living. So I reordered them now in succession of getting taken over, and you'll see the ones in red are the ones where they were occupied for a large proportion of the war. Philadelphia is only occupied briefly, and Lancaster is here because all those people from those different communities go to Philadelphia in large part, and then when Philadelphia gets invaded, they go inland to Lancaster. So Lancaster, not any great shakes before the war. It's just an outpost that's for trade, but becomes very important during the war. And we see it's not that everybody only goes to Philadelphia. Sometimes people go to Massachusetts or Connecticut, but in all of those places, those kind of refuge cities, we get Jews coming together who might not otherwise have ever met. They're coming from different places and congregating and are forging different dynamics and marriages and trade alliances that will really shape their experiences after the war. So some of the Jewish contributions that are really important to think about in terms of the Revolutionary War. First, I've focused a little bit more on patriots, and that's because, like other colonists, Jews were disproportionately siding with the patriots, but there were absolutely loyalists. There are both, it's not just the war happens to men, though older histories of the revolution make it seem that way. Women are also responding to what's going on in the war. And then those three big Jewish contributions: military services, finances, and provisions. So when the British invaded, of the 300 people, about 30 Jews remained behind in New York. Those were the people who had some loyalist leanings, but when it comes to signing the dress of loyalty to the conquerors, only 16 of the men of the Jewish community end up signing it. And of those, only one of them we know is like hardcore loyalist. The rest of them seem to have been, like many colonists, signing for economic reasons. And so one of the men who signed it is this man, Uriah Hendricks, and his brothers-in-law from the Gomez family also signed it. So we see some sort of, sometimes within families, a sort of leaning in one direction or another. Staying behind was important not just for the loyalists, but also for the Jews who had fled, because the people who stayed behind were able to secure relations with the British and to ensure that places such as the Mill Street Synagogue in New York was not taken over by the British and used for military purposes. However, and that's mainly because the loyalists are supplying provisions to the British, so they are able to have this negotiating power. However, it doesn't stop some renegade British soldiers from coming in and ransacking the congregation, burning 2 of the Torah scrolls, including one owned by Uriah Hendricks, who had signed that oath of loyalty. While we know that those invading Soldiers were then punished by their superior officers. It's a really important reminder that on both sides of the political spectrum, patriots and loyalists, Jews are experiencing a certain amount of anti-Semitism during the revolution. Uriah Hendricks is also interesting to me because it's not just him staying in the city. His wife dies right before the beginning. However, he has a lot of daughters as well as some sons who become very important after the war. And one of his daughters, Rebecca Hendricks, stitches not one, but 2 samplers during the Revolutionary War. And those are ones that she stitched during what we refer to as the hard winter of 1779 to 1780, which is the coldest winter ever on record for that region. Those 2 samplers both used, they looked better to begin with. So they've obviously not, they've suffered a little through time. Imagine they're pristine when she makes them. But they both use verses that refer to Exodus and do so very strategically to emphasize that you need to support King George III. So she uses a psalm, Psalm 78, which is one that the monarchs typically use to emphasize that you will be punished if you disobey the monarchs. And then you'll notice in the second one, which has the 10 Commandments, in between the tablets of the law, like we saw above the Torah arcs, we see she's put a crown. And that crown is a very deliberate echo of the crown of George III. It's very different from the ones we see going on in above the ark in Newport. So very nice that we have a loyalist girl is expressing her beliefs about the war in a mode that was important for women at the time, namely embroidery. So here, loyalty to God and loyalty to King George III go hand in hand for her. Oops, go back. So even before the war, we know that this wasn't unusual that Jewish women were seen as playing an important role in the continuity of Jewish communities, that I hope people notice the beautiful Megillah scroll that's out there. As I mentioned to some people as they were going through the exhibit, we know from the wills of Jews in the colonies that while Torah scrolls tended to be passed down from father to son, Megillah scrolls were often given to daughters as a way of maintaining lines. And these sorts of samplers, like the one by Rebecca Hendricks, are an important reminder of the changing role that women are playing during this moment, as women are started to be seen as important to those mercantile lines that are crucial for Jewish survival in the colonies. So in the early part of the 18th century, girls were educated, but they were typically taught in both Protestant and in Jewish communities in the colonies to read, but not to write necessarily. And around the time of the revolution, we see that shifting for Jews and Protestants, where Jewish women are also taught how to write. And in objects such as these samplers, we can see the alphabet at the top of the one on the right. Girls are showing, I'm writing, but I'm doing it in a way that's appropriately feminine. So a good Jewish girl's education. And those sorts of alphabets would later be used by women when they grew up to put their initials on linen in their household. In addition to this change in women's education, samplers are really important for us, our understanding of Jewish women's role in what scholars refer to as kin-keeping. So kin-keeping is one of those kind of techie terms, but I think will be familiar to a lot of women in the audience if your family is a little like mine, where the women are charged or take charge of doing things like buying the cards to send to people, or the gifts to give to your children and grandchildren, or calling people. Those are all things we think of as kin-keeping. And it turns out samplers were really important for that during the colonial period. So oftentimes samplers had names of family members in the sampler itself, or in the case of this one by Rebecca Hendricks, there's a family chart on the back of the sampler. Similarly, this is a moment where we see families, and this is a chart from the Gomez, Hendricks, and Satius families, which were all interwoven. Again, very few Jews, so they all marry each other during this time period. We have these family charts starting to emerge, but we also see Jewish women such as Sarah Rodriguez Rivera, aka Mrs. Erin Lopez, as she's often referred to, This cute little boy, Joshua, who's with her, grows up, gets married. Her many other children grow up and get married, and she is the person who, when the women marry into the family, tells her daughters-in-laws the history of the Rivera and Lopez families. So again, that's sort of bringing in and making people part of family lines. One of the major ways, so those are some of the things that are going on in terms of responses to the revolution. One of the three main pillars of how Jews contributed to the revolution was through military service. And here I think we see a glimmer of what some of those patriot Jews might have hoped would happen following the revolution if they sided with the patriots. Because one of the really revolutionary aspects of Washington's army was that Jews were allowed to march in regiments alongside non-Jews. So not only are Jews allowed in the military, probably because he needs people, but he's having them be part of regular armies. And this is very different from places like Curacao and Suriname, where Jews had to march in separate regiments, and anytime there was a parade, the Jews would march behind the Protestants, showing their second-class citizenship. So very important that that military service sort of is a glimmer of that hope that Jews have. And we see men such as Joshua Isaacs, who comes north. He's originally from the Caribbean. He comes north to the southern part of the 13 colonies, and then flees to Lancaster. He is one of the people who not only is he fleeing to Lancaster, but he's enrolling in the militia there and becoming part of the regiments. Again, marching alongside some of the non-Jews. And we see that throughout the different parts of the 13 colonies, that Jews are signing up to be part of these militias, sometimes on the loyalist side, but disproportionately on the patriot side. And in some instances, there are so many Jews joining up, such as in Charleston, that one of the regiments has 23 Jews in it and gets known colloquially as the Jews Regiment. And that's not because it was only Jews, but because so many Jews were serving. In addition to that service that Jews are doing in the military, Jews are really disproportionately important compared to their small numbers for the provisions that they're supplying. And here we're seeing men such as Isaac Moses in New York, Aaron Lopez in Newport, Barnard and Michael Gratz from Philadelphia, sending agents down to those islands in the Caribbean, particularly St. Eustatius, in order to make sure that they have trading partners during the war that are gonna send supplies northward. And that includes both what I refer to as sexy provisions, which are things like guns and ammunition, but also those unsexy provisions, things like food and shoes that are really necessary for the Patriots to win. We know that during that cold winter, when Rebecca Hendricks was stitching her samplers, that the Patriots thought they weren't going to be able to continue because they were starving. So food, crucial to winning the war. So here's another moment where those networks around the Atlantic world become so important for Jews' role. Jews disproportionately become merchants in some way. They aren't always like owners of ships. Sometimes they're poor and working in storefronts, but they're disproportionately merchants because they're often denied the ability in places to have other types of professions. So those networks that they've built through kinship ties allow them to bring in trade from Europe, from South America, from the Caribbean, up into Newport. And you can see why St. Eustatius, even though it's so small, becomes so crucial. It's really at this turning point in the Caribbean. That community in St. Eustatius were not, those 600 Jews were not all fabulously wealthy when they came to St. Eustatius. Honin Dalim, which is the synagogue which survives today in ruins because it was burnt by the British, translates as gracious to the needy. And we know that Amsterdam started to get flooded with poor Jews. So there was no state welfare at this point. Jewish communities had to care for their own. All these Jews start flooding into Amsterdam to that glorious big synagogue, and they are overwhelming the community. So Amsterdam starts sending people on a one-way ticket to the colonies in order to help them start a new life. Sometimes those Jews will come back and they'll get sent again. So one of those people, Rachel Mendez Balborda, is one of the women who gets sent when she's impoverished to the colonies, hoping that she'll be able to start over. For the British, the island of St. Eustatius becomes a huge thorn in the side, and Admiral Rodney recognizes the Jews are playing a decisive role in terms of sending provisions. And he decides he's going to invade the island, and he rounds up all the Jews, kicks them off the island, and takes all of their goods away from them. So he takes all of the money that they've earned, as well as any provisions that they had. These are men such as Moses Myers, the agent of Isaac Moses, and during that rounding up, a lot of the Jews who had been risking a lot of doing provisions lose everything and suffer tremendously under Rodney. I think this is also, however, a great example of anti-Semitism sometimes does not pay, because while Rodney was down trying to get rid of the Jews in St. Eustatius, the French were able to run past the blockade into Yorktown, and it was a decisive victory as a result for the patriots. So really important that want doesn't pay. I would say the other want for Rodney is that when he's sending back all the stuff he stole from the Jews to England, which he thought he was going to be able to keep, it gets captured by the French. So the French end up getting it instead. I feel like this is a lesson we should put out there more. Doesn't pay. The second big thing, in addition to those provisions that Jews were doing, was providing financial influence. And here I think that probably Chaim Solomon is the most famous example of that. And I think sometimes people think that maybe he just took a bag of money and gave it to the patriots. And that's not really how the financial influence worked. He was a broker. He made arrangements. He did give some of his own money, but he mainly made arrangements with people who could lend money to people who needed money. In addition, Chaim Solomon worked as a spy during the British occupation of New York. And in between being arrested twice, he manages to marry one of the girls in a patriot family. So this is his marriage contract. We also see, however, that financial influence coming across in some of the objects that were owned by Jews at the time, including this beautiful gold snuff box made by Meyer Myers, the most famous Jewish silversmith in the colonies. And you'll see that it has a scene from King David on it. And objects like this were meant to show that Jews could be good patrons, just like Amsterdam was a patron to the colonies. Jews could be patrons, not just to revolutionaries, but also to impoverished Jews. So Jews are poor in the same percent as anybody else in the colonies. And we know that about a third of the finances of Shearith Israel went to paying for impoverished Jews in the New York community. Those were women like Hannah Lusada, who would write each year in order to ask for money to pay for her rent, for her food, and for wood to get her through the winter. When the congregations didn't necessarily supply as much as she would have liked, she turned to the wealthier Jews in the colonies. So this is a letter she wrote in Spanish to Aaron Lopez, her husband, Sarah Rodriguez Rivera, asking for supplementary money. So when we look at portraits of the Jews and they're showing off their wealth, I think it's important to realize part of that is showing, I am a patron, I am somebody who will be able to take care of the community going forward. So in all of those ways, in terms of the provisions, the finances, the military support, Jews were having this disproportionate influence for their numbers on what happened during the revolution. But when we'll see in the aftermath, the revolution also had a tremendous impact on Jews going forward. And part of that has to do with the ways that people returned to the communities. Second, to the marriages that were made during the revolution. Third, to some of the letters back and forth with Washington and other leaders. And then to the subsequent rise and fall of communities related to the British occupation. So first of all, there is the return to communities. Those 30 Jews who were hanging out in New York get supplemented by Jews coming back, trying to find out what had happened to all of their belongings after the fire, and having to rely on the synagogue that had been safeguarded by the loyalist Jews. We know that this is the order in which the British left various cities. And so over time, people are sort of slowly coming back, first from Lancaster to Philadelphia, and then coming back to the cities of origin to try and restart the communities they had left behind. In addition to those fleeing back to cities, they brought with them new marriages and relations. So remember, a lot of these Jews lived in very small communities. They had a hard time finding marriage partners within them. But while they're taking refuge in places like Lancaster and Philadelphia, people are making marriage alliances with people they otherwise never would have met. So it's not just Chaim Solomon who's marrying Rachel Franks in New York, but we're having a lot of marriages happening in Lancaster amongst people who've taken refuge there. So these are women like Belle Simon, who marries Solomon Myers Cohen, and we know that they saved a lot of these beautiful slippers that the women wore to their weddings at the time and would pass them down through family lines as a way of reminding their descendants of the power of those family connections that were made during the war. Two pairs of the, I don't know why, well, I do know why they're always yellow. Ask me in the Q&A, why are the slippers always yellow? So the slippers are almost always yellow for this time period, and we know that two of those pairs of slippers followed Rachel Gratz Edding, who's the daughter of Barnard Gratz, one of the main merchants, who's a shoe merchant a lot of the time, and Solomon Edding. They get married in Lancaster after his first wife passes away, and after the war, they go south, not to one of those pre-established communities, but to Baltimore, where the family becomes really important for starting a new fledgling community. Other people who married in Lancaster are people like Joshua Isaacs and Justina Lazarus. She is from Baltimore. He is originally from the Caribbean, then through the South. Again, people who otherwise never would have met, making these new alliances in Lancaster. After the war, they will return to New York, where their son Solomon will go into business with Frances Isaacs' husband, so daughter and son of this couple that marries in Lancaster. She's born in Lancaster. Their house is the oldest surviving house in Greenwich Village, and their son and son-in-law become important copper merchants who supply the copper that helps the US win the War of 1812. In addition to those marriage alliances, we start to see Jews trying to take up on those promises that they thought might be there in terms of that ability to march side by side with people of other religions. And we see not just Newport, but also a lot of the other early congregations writing letters back and forth to Washington, asking, hey, what kind of rights are we going to have in this new nation? And the news is quite good. And something that, whoops, let me go back one more. Something that I think we like to think, oh, the Jews knew the Patriots were going to be great to them. Probably not. Like, that was the dream, right? But Washington's letters back and forth become the moment when Jews start to make good on the promise that they had dreamed of. So we'll see here in his letter back, he mentions that this new government will be a place where people have inherent natural rights, that will give to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, and that it will provide protection to its citizens. So I think, as we all know, those are promises we still, for many generations, keep on trying to make good on in terms of the United States. But these letters become a place that Jews can go back to say, this is in the founding documents of the United States, that we should have freedom from persecution. Across the United States, that you're going to see that follow-up on that promise that we're getting in those letters slowly playing out over time, and succeeding generations will start to continue to have these letters back and forth to people like Jefferson and Madison. And one of those happens from Jacob de la Mata when he writes after the founding of the consecration of the synagogue in Savannah in 1820. And he writes trying to point out that he's looking for rights. And Jefferson again writes back stating how important the ability to have different religious beliefs is to the unity of the United States. So he says, in contrast to politics, having this phrase should be divided we stand, united we fall in terms of religion. So he's kind of flipping the table, saying that's what's important for the United States. In addition, he points out that for men of science like Jacob de la Mata, science should be the first stepping stone towards getting full civil rights and Jews' admittance into government. So we know that a number of the Jews who came south from Lancaster and other places, particularly that man who had the wife with the yellow slippers, Solomon Edding, end up doing these petitions in the 1820s trying to get the different states to sign on, for example, in Maryland, to allowing Jews to participate in government without having to say an oath to Christ. For the returning communities, the war ends up being both a boon to certain communities as well as decimating for others. You'll notice it looks like we've got fewer Jews now than before, and that's partially because the loyalists left. So after the war, the loyalist Jews are escaping to Canada, to England, to the British West Indies. But we also see that this is a relic of the fact that, again, we don't have good number counting. So there may just be a difference in terms of total population based on not that Jews disappeared, but we can't count well for that time period. So we see New York, again, there'll be some debate, New York or Charleston at the very top, Philadelphia next. Savannah sort of holds steady, but Newport starts to go into decline. For the rebuilding of New York, the return of Jews from Philadelphia, such as Isaac Moses and Gershom Anastasius, is crucial for that rebuilding, not just of the Jewish community, but the founding of New York as being an important mercantile center. We see something similar in Charleston, which becomes a rising star for Jewish communities and builds its first synagogue in 1794, and includes members such as Jacob Cohen, who was one of the Jews who fought in the revolution on behalf of the patriots. For the Philadelphia, it also surges because of the revolution. As I mentioned, there was that first synagogue that gets built during the war because suddenly the refugees are overwhelming the number of seats that they have in their house where they're holding services, and they have people with money coming in who can help build this synagogue. And we see people like Isaac Moses going back and forth between Philadelphia and New York even after the revolution. Following the revolution, Philadelphia will become one of the flagship communities for changing American Jewish life. Rebecca Gratz, the son of one of those traders who was trading down in St. Eustatius, will become somebody who reshifts how women are perceived in Jewish communities, but it's also a place where we get the first translation of the Bible by a Jew into English, published in the United States, as well as attention to Jewish orphanages and to Jewish education. Savannah does get people coming back, such as the Sheftals, Mordecai Sheftal and his son, Sheftal, which I feel like is the laziest of naming ever. But they come back after being taken captive by the British, along with their wife and mother, Frances. They come back to Savannah, but it's really a pretty slow growth for Savannah following the war. The first synagogue isn't built till 1820. It burns down almost immediately and gets rebuilt, the one that you see here in 1840. The greatest loser, however, of all of the communities from the war was Newport, completely decimated by the British in terms of their just destruction of structures and of the infrastructure. But in addition, when Mrs. Aaron Lopez, Sarah Rodriguez Rivera, and her husband, Aaron Lopez, are coming back from Massachusetts, where they'd spent the revolution, while they're crossing a pond in a carriage, a fluke accident happens and Aaron Lopez drowns. So he's the big patron of the community, and the community never really gets back off its feet until the latter part of the 19th century when we get a new wave of Jews coming in. And Mrs. Lopez ends up going off to New York instead. So in conclusion, I want to highlight the ways in which the American Revolution is sort of a missed opportunity for historians, for people who haven't thought about Jewish contributions. It's not just that Jews played a disproportionate role in terms of the military, the provisions, the financing of the revolution, but also that the revolution really changes the nature of Jewish American communities. Those changes will get magnified in the 1840s to 50s when a new group of Jews, mainly from German lands, will come into the United States and refound new institutions. But for all the work that they do, it's always on the shoulders of that generation that lived through, survived, and then flourished following the revolution. Thank you so much. I believe I can take question and answers. And again, I think I'm supposed to remind you, this means you are going to be recorded. Yes, thank you. Yes. We're going to give you a microphone, I guess.
Thank you. Wanted to know if you reached out to Ken Burns, and also how did you get involved in this research?
Yeah, thank you. So I have not reached out to Ken Burns. I feel like maybe someday I'll have enough chutzpah that I'll do that. I'll be like, hey, man, what about the Jews? My scholarship, I am primarily a scholar of early American Jews. I primarily work on material culture, so that's objects of everyday life. I think I'm involved in now 5 different exhibitions on Jews in 1776. And my current book is revolving around the Hendricks family that you saw some of the samplers and whatnot from here. So for me, this is sort of a golden year. You know, there's so few times when people are like, hey, what about Jews in colonial America? I'd like to hear more about that. But particularly I would say my skill set in terms of working on objects does make me sort of a natural partner for working with museums and exhibitions, because I'm interested not just in documents, but also in those objects that give us a richer sense of what daily life looked like. Yeah, so thank you so much for that question.
2 quick questions. Were they arranged marriages or love marriages?
Love that question.
And were the Jews involved in the slave trade? And to what extent were they involved in the slave trade? There's lots of accusations now about that.
Yeah, thank you. Both fantastic questions. So the first one, love matches versus arranged matches. I have a book called The Art of the Jewish Family that's on 5 objects owned by Jewish women in early New York, which is very much on this subject. So one of the things that we're seeing during this time period is still the remnants of, if not completely arranged marriages that I often feel like are between the fathers of the people getting married. So even into the 20th century, you see a little bit of that economic influence. But by the generation of people like Rebecca Gratz, marriages are becoming much harder for people to make within the Jewish communities, because they start entering into wanting to marry for love. And that means if you thought there were small pickings before, finding somebody you actually like is even harder. So we do see a lot of letters between Rebecca Gratz and her sisters about somebody came, man, was he dull, I would never marry him, as well as at some point, one of Rebecca Gratz's sisters marries the son of Isaac Moses, that merchant, and apparently Solomon Moses was super boring. And at some point, her sister says, oh my gosh, I realized I'm in love with him. So after all these letters mocking him, she has to write to her sisters and say like, hey, I know I said he was so boring, but I think I'm gonna marry him. Can you talk to my sister and make sure she's still on board with this? So it's really a time period where we're starting to see a little bit of a shift, but still a lot of economic influence in terms of how marriages are made. Great question. Second question was about the slave trade. So Jews are not disproportionately involved in owning enslaved people compared to other people in the colonies. There are some Jews, Aaron Lopez, Sarah Rodriguez Rivera's father, who's Aaron Lopez's first cousin, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, being 2 of the examples of unusual examples where people were actually involved in transporting enslaved people. That said, we do know that Jews were involved not just in selling enslaved people, but holding enslaved people, engaging in other aspects of the triangle trade because they're merchants. I feel like a lot of this lies behind the book that I did called Once We Were Slaves, which is looking at the very complex relations in this multiracial Jewish family where the children are born enslaved. The father is somebody who is one of the largest enslavers on the island of Barbados, and really thinking about those complexities of what happens within Jewish families revolving around issues of slavery. So I sometimes feel like wanting to do that number crunching of Jews are not disproportionately enslaving people sort of important because there have been these anti-Semitic tropes of Jews were responsible for the slave trade. No. But were Jews involved in the slave trade? Yes. Were Jews involved in enslaving people? Yes. And what was happening with that? So again, that book, Once We Were Slaves, is very much about this topic of how do we go back and reckon with that history. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I remember reading about Jonas Phillips, who sent a letter to the Constitutional Convention. I think it was to implore them to not put a religious test. But do you have, maybe we can talk about that, but also other examples where Jews might have influenced the foundational documents of our republic?
Yeah, so Jonas Phillips is really the key example of that in terms of those influencing the foundational documents. And I think he's such a fascinating example because he begins as somebody who has so few rights within society and then is really working very disproportionately compared to other members of the Jewish community in terms of ensuring that Jews will have rights going forward. So he's the main example that I can think of that's working before the revolution. Following the revolution, we start to get Jews very heavily involved in terms of writing letters and being part of that reshaping of US policy. So, great question. You have one? Okay.
Hello, thank you very much. A wonderful presentation. I have two questions. Do you know if Alexander Hamilton was involved at some degree with the Jewish community? That's my first one. And the second is, do you have any knowledge of some degree of participation of the Jewish community in the speculation of native lands? And
the speculation of what?
Native lands, indigenous lands, that evolved and had some degree of, flourishment during the revolution.
Yeah, thank you. So the first question, so I think the answer to the second one is I don't know a lot about that, which is a little surprising in that my first book was in Native American Studies, but no, so I don't know the answer. What was the first question? Hamilton, thank you. So I've already alluded with the question of numbers that scholars disagree on things. So I would say this is a point where I disagree with the person who's written the book about Hamilton. I have gone back and looked at the primary sources that were used for deciding whether Hamilton was Jewish, and I'm skeptical of how he's reading a lot of them. That one of the main things that gets pointed to is Hamilton having gone to a Jewish school. So Jewish women do not primarily take over the synagogue schools until starting in about the 1820s to 30s, mainly 1830s to 40s. So most of the schools that are in congregations, they're all in the Caribbean as well as in the 13 colonies. All those schools are being run by men. That said, there are Jewish women who are running what are called dame schools or schools out of their homes. Those are schools that anybody could attend. They aren't particularly Jewish. They just happen to have somebody Jewish involved. So when you look back at the original records and it says people have later characterized it as a Jewish school, it actually just says in the original records that it was a Jewish woman who owned the school. And again, very unlikely at the time that that would have been the official school of the congregation. So because of those things and some other pieces of evidence, I'm skeptical that Hamilton was Jewish or like really growing up, wedded to the Jewish community through his parents. I think the more interesting part of the book on Jews and Hamilton, which I think is a really important contribution to the scholarship, is that he is looking at the ways in which Hamilton had really important relations with Jews going forward. So we know that Hamilton and Isaac Moses were definitely working together a lot of the time, and that was a really important relationship, as well as some of the relationship with other Jews in New York. And for me, it's less interesting that somebody has to be Jewish to be friendly to Jews, and maybe more exciting that somebody not Jewish is interested in helping Jews out. So in that sense, I feel like it's kind of not disappointing if he's not Jewish, but just happens to be one of those people in New York who's not Jewish at the time, who's really interested in forging relationships with Jews. So thank you for asking the question. Again, I'm sure somebody else could get up and disagree with me. So yeah, there's a question in the front. And then how many more questions can I take? 2, okay, 2 more questions.
Hello,
Thank you.
you mentioned that Jefferson and Madison said that knowledge of, or I guess science was like a foundation. And in those days, did science mean knowledge more generally, or what were they talking about?
So I think in that particular instance, Jefferson is actually trying to allude to the fact that Jacob de la Motta is a doctor, but presumably in order to become officially a doctor, you would have to have some science training. Sciences and that sort of knowledge is wedded to sort of Enlightenment thought. So I think for Jefferson, saying that you're a scientist means you're enlightened. You're not somebody who's kind of a magical thinker. You're somebody who's naturally could be part of government and be part of the leadership. It's a really good question because I don't think I would naturally see science, except for in Mexico right now, where the president is a scientist and a woman and Jewish, that I don't think of science as like the stepping stone to being in government. But Jefferson, because of how he understands science, does. And we have one last question up at the front here.
Thank you. I understand there was a movement at some point for Hebrew to be the official language of the United States. Do you have anything to say about that?
Oof, I don't know about that, so I will look into that. That's a great insight. I do know that some of the relationships between Jews and non-Jews during this early period end up being really important in terms of our early universities. So both Harvard and Yale are, I feel like I shouldn't say this as somebody at Princeton, but Harvard and Yale very influenced by Hebrew education and included in their curriculum. An early rabbi, heavily in scare quotes, comes to the United States and becomes the first Hebrew professor at Harvard, writes a Hebrew textbook. He's not a rabbi, but he is a Jew from Europe at the time, and he has to convert in order to do it. And then we know Ezra Stiles, who is one of the people who sponsored that beautiful painting of Cargill. When he becomes president, he's always hanging out with the Jews in Newport. So a lot of the great information we have about Jews in early Newport are from his diaries. I talk about him as sort of like the Harriet the Spy of the colonies, because he's always like writing notes about Jews in his diary. So when he goes and becomes president of Yale, he makes sure that Hebrew is part of their curriculum. So definitely those relationships with Jews end up being really important in terms of US education, particularly in the North, where you see certain kinds of Protestantism that envision themselves as being new Israelites and being sort of the new Hebrew nation. So Hebrew becomes very important. But I love that question. I will look into it. Thank you.